He came to the mountains to outrun a memory that had the persistence of a ghost. The memory had a sound, the grating whir of a helicopter's rotor struggling against dust-choked air. It had a smell, sun-baked earth and cordite. And it had a weight, a physical pressure in his chest that had followed him from the bone-dry landscapes of Afghanistan to the damp, breathing forests of the Pacific Northwest. Elias Thorne had thought that if he could find a place quiet enough, the memory might finally lose his trail. He stood now on what was once a logging road, a scar half-healed by time and green tenacity. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wet soil, a clean, honest smell that felt like a penance. He was a man carved from discipline and regret, tall and lean in his early 40s, with the kind of stillness that came from years of holding a rifle sight steady while his heart hammered against his ribs. His uniform was self-imposed. A faded olive M65 field jacket, a worn flannel shirt, cargo pants, and leather boots whose soles were imprinted with the geography of a dozen forgotten places. On his wrist, a military-issue watch ticked with relentless, unforgiving precision, measuring out the silence he had come to seek. His pack, an Eberly stock half-track, held everything he needed and nothing he didn't. It was a life distilled to its essentials. Beside him, also still, sat Boone. The German shepherd was a veteran of the same wars, though his battles had been fought with his nose and his teeth. His muzzle was turning a soft, distinguished gray, and his dark eyes held a calm, assessing intelligence that went far beyond mere animal instinct. Boone was not a pet. He was a partner. The last living link to a life Elias was trying to forget, and the only anchor in the one he was trying to build. The dog didn't offer comfort in the effusive, tail-wagging way of other dogs. He offered presence, a shared, unspoken understanding of the watchfulness the world demanded. He was never entirely off duty, and neither was Elias. They had been hiking for 3 days, pushing deeper into the Cascade Range, following the faint trace of the road as it dissolved into a footpath, then little more than a game trail. The silence here was different. It wasn't empty. It was layered, composed of the whisper of wind through 100-foot firs, the distant percussion of a woodpecker, the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. It was a living silence, and for the first time in years, Elias felt the knot in his shoulders loosen by a fraction. He unslung his pack, the motion economical and practiced. Time to make camp for the night. As he began to assess the small clearing, looking for a level spot, he noticed Boone hadn't moved. The dog was a statue of focused intent. His body was rigid, his head cocked, his ears swiveling to catch a sound Elias couldn't hear. His gaze was fixed on a dense thicket of ferns and young alder trees just off the trail. A low rumble started deep in Boone's chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression, but of profound unease. It was a sound Elias hadn't heard in years, a specific frequency that meant something was fundamentally wrong with the landscape. It was the same sound Boone had made seconds before an IED had turned a dusty road into a crater of fire and smoke. Elias froze, his hand hovering over the clasp of his pack. He trusted the dog's senses more than his own. His own were compromised by memory, clouded by the ghosts he was trying to outrun. Boone's were pure, an unvarnished report on the state of the world. Elias scanned the trees, his eyes tracing the shadows, looking for the telltale signs of a predator, a mountain lion, a bear. He saw nothing. The forest was still. The birds had gone quiet. The mountain seemed to be holding its breath.
"What is it, boy?" Elias murmured, his voice a low rasp, swallowed by the immense quiet.
Boone didn't look at him. He remained locked on the thicket, the low growl a constant, vibrating warning. This was different. It wasn't the scent of an animal, it was something else, something that didn't belong in this wild, forgotten place. The fragile peace Elias had started to feel evaporated, replaced by the familiar, cold vigilance that had kept him alive for 2 decades. The silence no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a warning. The next morning broke cold and gray, a low mist clinging to the shoulders of the mountains. The unease from the night before had settled in Elias's bones. Boone had remained watchful, sleeping with his head on his paws but his ears alert, twitching at every snap of a twig. Elias broke camp with his usual efficiency, but his movements were slower, more deliberate. He kept his folding knife clipped to his pocket, easily accessible.
He drank his coffee black and strong, standing, watching the woods. Boone hadn't forgotten. After a short, silent meal, the dog stood and looked pointedly at the thicket, then back at Elias. The message was clear. This was not something to be left behind. This was something to be faced. With a resigned sigh, Elias shouldered his pack. "All right, let's see what's spooking you." He followed Boone, pushing through the wet ferns that soaked the legs of his pants. The air grew colder as they moved deeper into the thicket, away from the faint trace of the logging road. Boone moved with a purpose that was unnerving, his nose to the ground, his tail held low and straight. He wasn't tracking an animal. He was following a line, a scent of something old and wrong. After about 50 yards, Boone stopped. He stood over a patch of ground where the earth was slightly sunken, covered in a thick mat of moss and fallen needles. He whined softly, a sound of anxious discovery, and then began to dig. He didn't dig with the frantic energy of a dog burying a bone, but with a methodical, determined scraping, pushing dirt away with his front paws. Elias watched for a moment, the hair on the back of his neck prickling. He set down his pack and took out his entrenching tool, the compact shovel a familiar weight in his hands. "Easy, boy. Let me." He knelt beside Boone and began to clear the ground. The soil was soft and loamy, full of roots. A few inches down, the shovel struck something hard with a dull, metallic thud. Not a rock. The sound was hollow, resonant. Elias scraped away the dirt, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. He uncovered a flat, rusted surface, pitted and brown. He cleared a wider area, his movements quickening. It was a corner, a seam, a rivet. It was the roof of a vehicle. He worked for the rest of the day, a man possessed by a quiet, consuming curiosity. The sun burned through the mist, casting dappled light through the canopy as he dug. He forgot about time, about the miles he had planned to cover. The only thing that mattered was the shape emerging from the earth. By late afternoon, he had uncovered enough to see what it was. An armored car. An old one, maybe from the 60s or 70s, built like a bank vault on wheels. It was half buried on a steep incline, its nose pointed downhill, as if it had tried to claw its way back up before being swallowed by the earth. Its tires were gone, rotted away, and its olive-drab paint was flaking, revealing the rusted steel beneath. It had been deliberately hidden. The pit it rested in was too uniform for a crash, and large rocks and felled logs had been piled against its sides before being covered with decades of soil and forest debris. This was a tomb. Elias circled it, his boots sinking into the excavated mud. He ran a hand over the cold, rough steel. Who would go to such lengths to bury a truck in the middle of nowhere? He found a door, its hinges frozen with rust. Using the shovel as a lever, he put his weight against it, grunting with the effort. Metal shrieked in protest, a sound that echoed unnaturally in the quiet woods. With a final groaning pop, the door swung open a few inches, releasing a rush of stale, musty air. Boone, who had been watching from a safe distance, crept forward, his nose twitching.
He sniffed at the dark opening, then looked back at Elias, giving a short, permissive bark. Elias pulled a small flashlight from his pack and peered inside. The interior was surprisingly well preserved, a time capsule sealed away from the elements. There were no bodies, no signs of violence. Instead, there were signs of life. On the floor, a half-dozen tin cans were stacked in a neat pyramid. A heavy canvas water bag hung from a hook, long since dry and brittle. On one of the metal benches that lined the walls sat a leather-bound journal, its cover warped but intact. And chained to the floor was a heavy, steel strongbox. He looked closer at the driver's compartment. The key was still in the ignition, as if the driver had intended to return. But the most unsettling detail was the seatbelts. They hadn't been unbuckled. They had been sliced through with a knife. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was an escape. Someone had been in this truck, had lived in it for some time, and had left in a hurry. They had left everything behind, except themselves. Elias reached in and picked up the journal. The leather was cold and stiff. He felt a profound sense of trespassing, of stepping into a story that had been waiting in the dark for 40 years. He looked from the armored car to Boone, who sat watching him, his intelligent eyes seeming to understand the gravity of the discovery. The quiet of the mountains was no longer about escaping his own past. Now, it was about unearthing someone else's. The journey to Cedar Creek took the better part of a day. Elias moved with a new urgency. The heavy strongbox secured in his pack, its weight a constant reminder of the mystery he carried. The journal was tucked safely in an inner pocket of his jacket. He left the armored car as he had found it, a sleeping iron giant in its earthen bed, deciding that drawing attention to it before he knew what he was dealing with would be a mistake. Cedar Creek was a town that seemed to be clinging to the edge of the wilderness by its fingernails. A single main street was lined with a mix of proud, historic brick buildings and tired-looking storefronts. Logging trucks rumbled through, a constant reminder of the town's lifeblood. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and a stranger like Elias, with his quiet intensity and military bearing, would be noticed. His first stop was a hardware store that smelled of sawdust and machine oil. He bought a small pry bar and a can of penetrating oil, earning a curious but silent look from the old man behind the counter. His next stop was the county clerk's office, a stately brick building with tall, arched windows. He needed maps. He needed to know who had owned that land, who had built that road. The office was cool and quiet, smelling of old paper and floor wax. A woman sat behind a high counter, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked to be in her late 50s, with a spare, no-nonsense frame and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. A small nameplate on the counter read, Sarah Jenkins, County Ranger. She looked up as he approached, her expression neutral but assessing. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for old survey maps," Elias said, his voice low. "Specifically for the logging roads north of Cougar Peak. From the 1970s, if you have them." Ranger Jenkins studied him for a long moment. "That's restricted access area. Most of those roads have been decommissioned for decades. What's your interest?" "Historical," Elias said, offering a half-truth. "I'm a backpacker, interested in the history of the area." She didn't seem convinced, but she nodded slowly. "We have archives. It'll take some digging." She led him to a back room filled with filing cabinets and large, flat drawers containing rolled-up maps. The air was thick with the dust of forgotten records. For an hour, she helped him, her initial caution giving way to a grudging respect for his methodical approach. They found a series of maps from a company called North Cascade Mining and Timber. The road he was on was clearly marked, but on a revised map from 1978, it was gone, simply erased, the area shaded in with a note, "Decommissioned post-survey incident." Unstable geology. Survey incident, Jenkins mused, tapping the note with her finger. That's vague. I've been working this county for 30 years. I've heard stories, but nothing concrete.
A surveyor for the mining company went missing around that time. The official story was he took off, but the locals always thought there was more to it. Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Did he have a name?
Can't recall it offhand, she said, her eyes narrowing slightly, her curiosity rekindled. Why? You find something out there? Just an old campsite, Elias lied smoothly. Looked like it was abandoned in a hurry. He thanked her for her time and left, feeling her gaze on his back. He now had a piece of the puzzle, but it only made the picture darker. His last stop was the Cedar Creek Historical Society, a small museum housed in the old train depot. The place was run by a man named Arthur Finch, a stooped, elderly man with thick glasses and a passion for local history that bordered on obsession. The museum was cluttered with artifacts, rusted logging saws, faded photographs, and glass cases filled with mineral samples.
Elias showed Arthur the photo he'd taken of the armored car on his phone.
The old man's eyes widened behind his spectacles. "Well, I'll be," he breathed, leaning closer. "A Guardian Mark IV. North Cascade Mining used 2 of those back in the 70s for their payroll and geological sample transport. Said they were worried about union trouble. Where on earth did you find this?" "Up near Cougar Peak," Elias said, keeping his voice level. Arthur shook his head slowly. "That's the area of the big survey project. They were looking for molybdenum. Caused a huge uproar. People were worried about their water, their land. The company promised riches, but a lot of folks felt they were being strong-armed." He looked at Elias, his expression serious. "That surveyor who disappeared. His name was David Cheney. He was a good man, an outsider, but he cared about this place. He started asking questions the company didn't like. Then one day he was just gone."
His truck was found at the bus station in Seattle, but no one ever saw him get on a bus. People here always said he found something he wasn't supposed to find. Back in the anonymity of a cheap motel room on the edge of town, the pieces began to fit together. Elias laid the pry bar and the can of oil on the worn carpet next to the strongbox. Boone lay on the floor near the door, a silent, watchful sentinel. The room was stuffy and smelled of stale cigarette smoke, a world away from the clean air of the mountains. He worked the pry bar into the seam of the strongbox. It was slow, difficult work. The steel was thick, the lock formidable. Metal groaned and scraped. Finally, with a sharp crack, the lock broke. The lid popped open. The contents were not what he expected. There was no money, no precious metals. It was filled with paper, meticulously organized files bound with string. He lifted out the top file. It was a geological survey report, filled with technical data, but attached to it was a smaller, hand-drawn map. It showed the survey area, but it also showed a dark plume, an underground contamination spreading from the company's exploratory drilling sites directly toward Cedar Creek's watershed. He dug deeper. There were water sample test results from a private lab showing levels of arsenic and lead that were orders of magnitude above safe limits. There were sworn, notarized affidavits from local farmers and ranchers detailing threats and intimidation tactics used by North Cascade's land agents to force them to sell their property at a fraction of its value. It was a comprehensive record of a crime, a conspiracy to poison a valley and steal its land for profit. Finally, at the bottom of the box, he found the journal. He opened it carefully, its pages stiff and yellowed. The handwriting was neat, precise.
It was the diary of David Cheney.
He read for hours as the light outside faded from gray to black. Cheney's entries detailed his growing suspicion, his secret water tests, his horror at what he was uncovering. He wrote of being followed, of his office being broken into, of quiet threats from his superiors. The final entry was dated October 12, 1978. They know. I saw them watching my cabin last night. They're not going to let me walk away with this. I'm taking the proof, and I'm going to disappear into the woods until I can get it to someone who will listen. The armored car is my only chance. It's been sitting decommissioned at the old staging area for months. I've stocked it with what I need. If I don't make it out, this box holds the truth. I am leaving it for whoever finds it. My name is David Cheney. I was a geologist. I tried to do the right thing. Elias closed the journal, his hands trembling slightly. David Cheney hadn't run. He had made a stand. He had created a time capsule of truth and buried it, hoping that one day integrity would find it. Elias felt a sudden, profound connection to the ghost in the machine. Cheney's choice, his lonely act of courage, resonated with the part of Elias that had been buried under years of duty and regret. He looked at the files spread across the motel room floor. This was no longer someone else's story. It was his. The weight in his pack had become the weight of responsibility. The next morning, as Elias was packing the evidence back into the strongbox, he heard the sound of an engine. It was a quiet, expensive sound, not the rumble of a logging truck. He looked out the motel room window. A black, late-model SUV had pulled into the parking lot. A man in a tailored gray suit got out. He was in his late 40s, with a confident posture and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He wasn't looking for a room. He was scanning the parking lot, his gaze lingering on Elias's mud-spattered truck. Elias knew, with a certainty that was bone-deep, that this man was not a tourist. He was the next chapter of the story. He had to get back to the armored car. The drive back up the mountain was a race against a clock he couldn't see. Elias pushed his old truck hard, the engine complaining as it climbed the winding Forest Service roads. He felt exposed, visible. The polite man in the suit represented a power that could move quietly and efficiently, a world away from the brute force he was used to confronting. This was a battle that would be fought with paper and lawyers, not bullets. But it would be fought on the ground he now considered his to defend. When he reached the end of the passable road, he parked his truck in a hidden alcove of trees and started the hike in, Boone trotting silently at his heel. He moved quickly, his senses on high alert. The forest, which had felt like a refuge 2 days ago, now felt like a contested space. He was halfway to the site when he heard it. The distinct sound of voices carried on the wind. He froze, motioning for Boone to stay. The dog sank to the ground, instantly motionless. Elias crept forward, using the dense undergrowth for cover, his movements as silent as a predator's. He reached the edge of the clearing. The pristine black SUV was there, parked impossibly far up the overgrown track. The man in the suit, whom Elias now thought of as Mr. Davies, stood with his arms crossed, surveying the half-excavated armored car. With him were 2 other men, dressed in rugged work clothes, carrying shovels and heavy-duty cutting tools. "I want it cleared and ready for transport by nightfall," Davies was saying, his voice calm and authoritative. "The Foundation is very clear on its reclamation protocols. This is an environmental hazard and a liability." "It's gonna take more than that, sir," one of the workers said, gesturing at the buried vehicle. "We'll need a winch, maybe even a small excavator." "Then get one," Davies said dismissively. "My instructions are to recover our property. The contents are incidental, historical curiosities. They will be archived and disposed of according to corporate policy."
Elias had heard enough. He stepped out of the trees and into the clearing. The two workers startled, spinning around. Davies, however, merely turned his head slowly, his polite smile clicking into place as if he had been expecting him. "Ah," he said, "the historian. I had a feeling you might have a vested interest in this artifact." "This is more than an artifact," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying in the clearing. He walked forward until he was standing on the opposite side of the excavation pit, the armored car between them. Boone came to his side, a dark, silent shadow.
"Is it?" Davies tilted his head. "To us, it's a piece of company history, a misplaced asset. We have the title, the records. Our legacy foundation is simply tying up loose ends from a bygone era."
He spoke in smooth, reasonable tones, the language of bureaucracy designed to sand the sharp edges off of ugly truths. "The name David Cheney," Elias said. "Is that just a loose end too?" The smile on Davies' face tightened almost imperceptibly. "I believe that was the name of a former employee who abandoned his post. A regrettable situation, but hardly relevant after 40 years. "He didn't abandon his post," Elias said, his gaze unwavering. "He uncovered evidence that North Cascade Mining was poisoning the water table and stealing land. He tried to protect it. He tried to protect the people in the town you're now planning to build a luxury resort next to." Davies let out a small, condescending laugh. "You have a vivid imagination."
You find an old truck, and suddenly you've uncovered a grand conspiracy. Those are serious allegations. Based on what? The ramblings in a dead man's diary? The context is lost to time. The data is misinterpreted. It's all just paper.
"It's evidence," Elias countered, his voice like flint. "And this is a crime scene." Davies took a step forward, his politeness finally fraying, revealing the steel beneath. "This is private property. You are trespassing. My team is here to execute a lawful recovery. I suggest you take your dog and continue your hike before you find yourself entangled in legal matters you can't possibly comprehend." It was at that moment that Boone acted. He had been sitting silently, observing, his head low. As Davies gestured dismissively toward Elias, Boone rose to his feet. He didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He simply stood, planted his feet, and a growl started in his chest, so low it was more of a vibration than a sound. The hair along his spine bristled.
He bared his teeth just enough to show the white tips of his canines. It was a gesture of absolute, controlled warning. It was the judgment of a creature who could smell a lie, who could sense the predatory nature hidden beneath the expensive suit. Davies froze mid-step. His eyes flicked down to the dog, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine fear crossed his face. The veneer of corporate civility vanished, replaced by the raw understanding of a threat he couldn't neutralize with a contract or a court order. He took a half step back, composing himself, but the moment had been lost. "We will be back," he said, his voice clipped and cold, "with the proper equipment and the proper authority." He turned and walked back to his SUV, his men following close behind. The spell was broken. The quiet standoff was over, and the lines had been drawn. Elias stood his ground, his hand resting lightly on Boone's head, the dog's warmth a grounding presence. He watched the SUV execute a clumsy, multi-point turn and disappear back down the trail.
The forest was quiet again, but it was a tense, waiting silence. The storm was coming. The sky began to turn the color of a bruise late the next afternoon. The wind picked up, whispering threats through the high branches of the firs. A heavy, oppressive atmosphere settled over the mountain, mirroring the tension coiled in Elias's gut. He had spent the day fortifying his position, not with weapons, but with knowledge. He had reread Cheney's journal, memorizing names and dates. He had used his satellite phone, a piece of gear he carried for emergencies, to make one call. He'd left a message for Ranger Jenkins, giving her the coordinates of the armored car and 2 words: David Cheney. It was a risk, but he knew he couldn't do this alone. The system had to be engaged, even if he didn't trust it. The rumble he heard next was not thunder. It was the labored groan of a heavy engine.
He looked down the logging road and saw them coming. A large flatbed truck with a powerful winch mounted behind the cab, followed by Davies's black SUV. The storm and the antagonist were arriving together. Davies got out of the SUV, this time dressed in a practical, expensive-looking rain jacket. The pretense of the suit was gone. With him were the same 2 men from before, and a third, a younger man with the unmistakable posture of a former soldier. The man's eyes, unlike the others, were wary. He met Elias's gaze for a brief moment, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps shared experience, before looking away. This was Miller. "This is your final opportunity to leave," Davies announced, his voice raised to be heard over the rising wind. "We have a court order authorizing the removal of this vehicle from our property." He held up a piece of paper, letting it flap in the wind. A legal fiction, most likely, but it was a symbol of his power. Elias didn't move from his position near the open door of the armored car. Boone stood beside him, a low growl already starting in his chest. "You're not taking it," Elias said simply.
"We are," Davies replied, his patience clearly gone. He gestured to his men. "Get it rigged. I want this done before the storm hits full force." The men moved forward, unspooling a thick steel cable from the winch. Miller hesitated for a second, his eyes on Elias and Boone, before following orders. As they worked, the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and cold, splattering on the rusted steel of the truck and the dry forest floor. The wind was a physical force now, making the massive trees sway and groan. The crew was trying to attach the cable to the front axle of the armored car when it happened. A sharp crack, like a rifle shot, echoed above the howl of the wind. Elias looked up. A huge branch, a widowmaker thick as a man's torso, had broken loose from one of the old-growth firs overhead.
It was directly above the work crew.
"Look out!" Elias yelled, his voice instinctual, a commander's bark. The men scattered. The branch came crashing down, a ton of splintering wood and momentum. It missed the men, but it struck the edge of the excavation pit with incredible force, shaking the ground. It landed half on the armored car, its immense weight making the old vehicle groan and shift in the soft, rain-soaked earth. But it wasn't the truck that Elias was looking at. In the chaos, Boone had moved to place himself between Elias and the crew, a protective instinct. The falling branch had sent a shower of smaller debris and rocks flying. One of the rocks, sharp and heavy, had struck Boone's hind leg. The dog yelped, a sharp cry of pain that cut through the noise of the storm, and collapsed, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Time seemed to slow down for Elias. The roaring wind, the shouting men, the groaning metal of the truck, it all faded into a dull hum.
All he could see was Boone, lying on the wet ground, trying to get up, whimpering. And the memory, the ghost he had come here to escape, slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. The desert sun, the dust, the frantic shouts over the radio. Sergeant Miller, no relation to the man here, just a cruel coincidence of name, pinned down, bleeding. The objective was critical. The helicopter was waiting, its rotors kicking up a blinding storm of sand. The call had been his to make. "We can't wait. We have to go." He had chosen the mission. He had left a man behind. He had lived with the echoes of that choice every day since. He looked from Boone, his partner, his only real companion, to the armored car, which was now partially blocked by the fallen branch.
This was the objective, the evidence, David Cheney's legacy. He looked at Davies, who was already barking new orders, trying to salvage his operation from the chaos. The choice was the same.
The mission or the man, the partner at his side.
This time he didn't hesitate. He turned his back on the armored car, on Davies, on the entire conflict. He knelt in the mud beside Boone, his movements gentle, his focus absolute. "It's okay, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "I've got you. I'm right here." He ran his hands over the dog's leg, feeling the sickening break in the bone. Boone licked his hand, his eyes filled with pain and trust. For Elias, it was a moment of absolution. In that single, selfless act, in choosing loyalty over the objective, he was rewriting the single greatest failure of his life. He was not that man anymore. He would not leave anyone behind again. He carefully gathered the large dog into his arms. Boone was heavy, over 90 pounds, but Elias lifted him as if he were weightless. He stood up, cradling his injured partner, and started to walk away from the clearing, away from the fight. He didn't look back. His mission was clear. "Stop him," Davies yelled, his voice shrill with fury. "He can't just walk away." Miller, the young veteran, stood between Elias and the path out. He held a heavy tire iron from the truck. He watched Elias approach, saw the fierce, protective look in his eyes, the absolute devotion to the injured animal in his arms. He saw a commander, not a trespasser. He saw a code of conduct that he himself had once lived by. Elias met his eyes. He didn't stop. He didn't slow down. He was prepared to walk through him if he had to. Miller looked from Elias's determined face to Davies' enraged one. He looked at the tire iron in his hand. Then, in a small but decisive act of defiance, he lowered it. He took a half step to the side, clearing the path. "The winch cable snapped, sir," he called back to Davies, his voice suddenly full of feigned incompetence. "It's tangled in the drum. It's gonna take a while to fix." It was all the time Elias needed.
Just as he cleared the thicket and reached the old logging road, he saw it. The flashing red and blue lights of a vehicle cutting through the rain and the gloom. Ranger Sarah Jenkins's truck bounced up the trail, its engine roaring. She pulled to a stop, blocking the path completely. She got out, a rain slicker pulled over her uniform, her face set and serious. She took in the scene in an instant. Elias with the injured dog, the chaos in the clearing, Davies and his crew. Her eyes met Elias's. "Got your message," she said, her voice all business. "Started digging into North Cascade and David Cheney. You were right. He filed an anonymous complaint with the state 2 days before he disappeared. It was buried. Until now." The secret was out. It was no longer a matter of one man against a corporation. It was in the hands of the law. Public scrutiny, the one thing Davies and his foundation couldn't control, was coming. The tide had turned, not with a bang, but with a choice. A choice to stay. The morning after the storm was unnaturally quiet. The sky was washed clean, a pale, fragile blue. The air smelled of rain and damp earth. The clearing around the armored car was a different world. It was cordoned off with official yellow tape. Ranger Jenkins's truck was still there, along with 2 more from the state's Environmental Protection Agency. A team of forensic specialists was carefully documenting the site, their movements methodical and respectful. The armored car sat like a monument, its story finally being heard. Mr. Davies was there too, but his power had evaporated. He was standing by his SUV, stripped of his authority, being questioned by a stern-faced state investigator. His polite mask was gone, replaced by a pinched, resentful look.
He was just a man in an expensive jacket, now on the wrong side of a line he had thought he owned. Miller was there as well, giving a formal statement to another officer.
He caught Elias's eye from across the clearing and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of shared understanding, of a debt paid. Elias was not in the clearing. He was miles away, in the quiet, sterile-smelling waiting room of the Cedar Creek Veterinary Clinic. Boone was in surgery. The vet, a kind woman named Dr. Allen, had assured him the break was clean, and that with rest, Boone would make a full recovery. But the waiting was a familiar kind of hell. He sat staring at his hands, the knuckles raw from the dig, his mind replaying the events of the storm. He had won. He had protected Cheney's truth. But the victory felt hollow without his partner beside him. The bell on the clinic door chimed. Elias didn't look up until a woman's voice, a voice he hadn't heard in over a year, said his name. "Elias?" He looked up. It was his sister, Claire. She stood in the doorway, her face etched with worry. He had called her from the vet's office, a brief, halting conversation. He hadn't known who else to call. He had pushed her away after leaving the service, convinced his ghosts were his own to bear.
"I came as soon as I could," she said, her voice soft. She crossed the small room and sat beside him. She didn't hug him or ask a flood of questions. She just sat with him in the quiet, a simple act of presence that meant more than any words. "He's going to be okay," Elias said, his voice thick. "The doctor said he's strong." "I know," she said. "So are you." They sat in silence for a while longer. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the clinic's window. He saw the tired lines on his face, the gray at his temples. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't turn away from the man looking back at him. He saw someone who had faced his past and made a different choice. He saw someone who had stayed. Later that week, the story broke. The contents of the armored car, the meticulous records kept by David Cheney, became front-page news.
The lawsuit against the Development Corporation was massive. A class-action suit filed on behalf of the entire town of Cedar Creek. Cheney was no longer a forgotten footnote. He was a local hero. His lonely act of defiance, hidden for 40 years, had saved the valley. Ranger Jenkins met Elias for coffee a few days later. Boone was with him, his leg in a heavy cast, but his tail gave a weak thump against the leg of the table. "The state is designating the site as a historical landmark," Jenkins told him. "Cheney's armored car will be preserved. His story won't be buried again." She paused, taking a sip of her coffee. "The Forest Service is expanding its search and rescue program. We need a canine handler with your kind of experience, someone who knows the backcountry, someone who knows how to stay with a problem. The job is yours if you want it." Elias looked down at Boone, who rested his head on Elias's knee, his dark eyes looking up at him with unwavering loyalty. The mountains had been an escape, a place to run from the world. But now, they felt like something else. They felt like a place to stay, a place to put down roots. "I think we'd like that," Elias said. Months passed. The seasons turned. The vibrant green of summer gave way to the gold and crimson of autumn in the Cascades. Elias and a fully recovered Boone stood on a high, wind-swept ridge, looking down at the valley that was now their home. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of snow. From this vantage point, he could see the town of Cedar Creek, nestled in the crook of the river. He could see the vast, unbroken expanse of the national forest, the land David Cheney had died to protect. The scar of the old logging road was nearly invisible from here, reclaimed by the patient, relentless forest. The armored car was gone,
moved to a place of honor at the new David Cheney Memorial Park near the town entrance, a permanent testament to quiet courage.
Elias no longer wore his past like a shroud. The memory of Afghanistan was still there, a faint scar on his soul, but it no longer had the power to haunt him. It had been reframed, not erased, by the choices he had made in this new life. He had learned that redemption wasn't about forgetting. It was about remembering correctly, about using the pain of the past to forge a better present. Boone stood beside him, his graying muzzle lifted to the wind, his body relaxed but alert. He was no longer just a partner in a war they had both left behind. He was a companion in a peace they had earned together. The bond between them was deeper than words, forged in shared silence, tested in the storm, and solidified in the quiet aftermath. Elias reached down and rested his hand on the dog's broad head, his fingers scratching a familiar spot behind his ears. Boone leaned into the touch, a low sigh of contentment rumbling in his chest. They stood there for a long time, two veterans on the ridge, watching the sun dip below the jagged peaks. The silence that surrounded them was no longer heavy with unspoken grief. It was a peaceful silence, full of life, full of promise. It was the sound of a man who had finally come home. He had come to the mountains to lose a memory, but instead, he had found himself. He had earned his peace.